start the recording now. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us, and welcome to the November African Politics Online Colloquium. So we're going to be discussing Dr. Emeka Njoku's paper, Strategic Exclusion, Co-option, and Containment towards an Integrative Theory of State-CSO Relations. So Emeka is a postdoctoral fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies. Emeka, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. We really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to read. We're also lucky to have two fantastic discussants with us, and we really appreciate you taking the time. So first we have Dr. Amanda Murdie, who is a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And so her research focuses on INGOs, including the human security impacts of international INGOs, which is what her fantastic book, Help or Harm, examines. We're also very lucky to have with us Dr. Mark Sidel, who's a professor of law and public affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his research focuses on nonprofit and philanthropic organizations with a focus on China, Vietnam, India, and South Asia. And so thank you both so much for being with us today. I'm Alicia Perisky. I'm one of the APCG online colloquium organizers. I'll act as the moderator for today's discussion. And so we'll start with Emeka giving us a quick 5-minute overview of the paper, a brief background of the paper, and also maybe your goals for the paper. And then I'll turn it over first to Amanda and then Mark to give us you'll have 10 to 15 minutes to provide your comments on Emeka's paper. I'll then give Emeka just a few minutes to respond to those comments, and then open up the discussion to everyone else. So I just ask that if you're not talking, that you mute your microphones. And thank you everyone for being here today. I really, really appreciate it. So Emeka, I will turn it over to you.
All right, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I want to thank the APCG for organizing this colloquium. I mean, it's helpful for, a platform for some of us to present our papers and get good feedbacks. I also want to thank you, Alicia, for organization. And I thank the discussants for taking out time to review the papers, and also those that decided to attend. Now, my paper is titled The Strategic Exclusion, Containment Framework and Integrative Theory of State-Civil Society Relation. It was rooted in my PhD thesis, where I examined the intersections between counterterrorism and civil society organizations in Nigeria. And so I've been reflecting over these issues, reading the literature, and also wrote a systematic literature review, where I then come up with the idea of, bringing more like establishing an integrative theory now that brings all these ideas together. Now, first, a bit of a background. Now, after September 11, 2001 was a pivotal moment, not just because it restructured the security infrastructures of countries, but it contributed in obstructing the associational revolution that began in the 1980s to the late 1990s, as stated by Lester Salomon. In fact, it ushered in a period Mark Sidel here termed associational counter-revolution. So one of the prevailing views in terms of how states view civil society organization was that CSOs are one of the factors, changed state perception of CSOs was that CSOs have become complicit in the rise of terrorism because they served as a conduit for terrorist finance. And so as a result of this, a range of new laws were established, institutions and old laws were strengthened to regulate the operations of civil society organizations. One of the key institutions was the Financial Action Task Force that, established an international legal instrument known as the Recommendation 8. Now, this recommendation will direct state actors and non-state entities to regulate the finances of CSOs, or what they term vulnerable CSOs, even though they are the ones that would define who, CSOs that are vulnerable and those that are not. And so in both advanced and democracies, hybrid and authoritarian regimes, this regulation became a guise for targeting credible oppositions, advocacy groups, and human rights groups. So the exceptional nature of counterterrorism laws that glosses over issues of human rights in prosecutorial processes, was weaponized by state actors to repress and target civil society. In fact, scholars argue that the counterterrorism laws became a form of a legitimation for the crackdown of civil society organizations in different political contexts. And so this led to various, various scholars became interested and they looked at these issues in various contexts, and there were various case studies and comparative studies that examined the implementation of counterterrorism laws that, close down the operational spaces of civil society organizations. And this led to also theories of state-society relation, which includes Jude Howell and Jeremy Lin's co-option and containment framework, and Francis Dua's duality of coercion. There have been other concepts like managed civil societies that have been developed by scholars. So now, while I'm arguing that these two-way articulation have failed to account for various strategic options that are open to the state in their attempt to manage and regulate CSOs by deliberately foreclosing the opportunities that are open to them under the law. Moreover, I'm also arguing that there have been no comprehensive theory that connects these various variables, that shows how they interact. So, this also echoes what some scholars have said, that there's a dearth of theories or inadequacies of extant theories or models in explaining state CSOs' relation in a changing world, as existing models used in explaining these relations have become dated and in need of reassessment. And so I present the strategic exclusion, co-option and containment framework, or simply SEC, which underscores the general patterns of states' strategic engagement of CSOs in the context of counterterrorism. I map out secondary evidence in 19 countries and use 3 illustrative case studies such as Australia, Uganda, and Russia to examine the elements of this SEC theory. Now, the major assumption is that state actors deploy a coordinated approach that first isolates CSOs from contributing in the formulation of legislative drafts on counterterrorism, when even such proposed laws are aimed at regulating the CSO sector. Now, the state then leverages on this exclusion of the sector to enact laws that are strategically made ambiguous, such that it dissuades CSOs from operating due to apparent and real fear of criminal liability. Some of these vagueness in these laws can be seen in the definition of terrorism and the concept of material support, which has been a major legal issue between CSOs and states in different political contexts. Moreover, the inherent vagueness in the laws further empowers the states to construct or redefine the activities of CSOs as a violation of the law. Now, the strategic exclusion and ambiguity in the laws are apparent in the way the states, weaponize the law to delegitimize and criminalize the activities of CSOs as a violation of the law in order to gain public approval, to regulate and in some cases repress civil society organizations. However, recognizing CSOs' humanitarian and development qualities, the states, courts and co-opt CSOs that are willing to, serve its interests by focusing essentially on social service provision and not to challenge the state or influence public view against the state. So in other words, CSOs are being transformed to state adjutants or relays of power. So yeah, and my SEC theory predicts that in states where CSOs are perceived as national security threats or undermine national security objectives, state actors are more likely to adopt the SEC theory in their engagement with CSOs in the context of counterterrorism or in the context of conflict, violence, and security more broadly. This study, I believe, it makes several contributions to the literature. It responds to the call for new theories that would help us understand and explain state CSOs' relation in the changing world. It builds on extant conversation that there are no simple causal relation or no one-size-all-fits theory that explains state CSOs' relation in the context of counterterrorism. Now, broadly, the SEC theory contributes to forming a dynamic and integrative theory that explains state CSOs' relations in times of conflict, violence, and security, it integrates divergent yet related assumptions and concepts in a coherent framework that provides a wide-ranging rationalization on states' engagement of CSOs from a Copenhagen school or rational choice approach. Moreover, the SEC framework lays a broad foundation for generalizable theory and future empirical research on states' behavior towards CSOs in the context of violence, conflict, and security. Yeah, so now what I, like this is my first theory paper. I have not, it's like first time I'm writing a theory paper, and I'm hoping to get in terms of style, in terms of, I mean, practically everything, whatever contribution I believe, that would come from this conversation would be really helpful in reworking and restructuring the paper. So yes, I'm open to all forms of contributions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Emeka. I appreciate that, and good to know, how you're thinking about this. Professor Murdie, I think we'll start with you if that's okay.
Absolutely. To go around and do introductions very, very briefly for those of us who don't know some of the other people?
Yeah, we can do that very, very briefly.
Mark Sidel, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Law.
Amanda Murdie, University of Georgia, International Affairs.
Georgia Fosu, Assistant Professor, London School of Economics, Political Science.
Molly, maybe we could go to you.
Sure. Molly Ariadne, also University of Georgia, International Affairs.
Hello, my name is Janica Magat. I'm a PhD student at Texas A&M University, Political Science.
Thanks for joining us. And Mark? I'm not sure. Okay, I think we'll, go. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for those brief introductions. It's nice when we're such a small group to at least know each other. So thank you all so much. And yeah, Professor Murdie, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. This was a really excellent paper to read, and I learned a lot from my own work, so I thought it was great. So I'm gonna give you some comments for the group, Emeka, that really are helping to show what's great about the paper, and then some things, suggestions maybe to work on before you send it out for review. I'll start with a caveat that I'm not a comparative politics scholar as much as I am an IR scholar that does work on NGOs. So if I say something that's completely off, you can say that that's the reason why I didn't get it. So things that are great. So first of all, I love the connection to Copenhagen theory and securitization. I thought this was a really important contribution and is very well laid out in the paper. I loved the connection to the lawmaking phase of strategic exclusion. And I know you've written on that before, but we don't often think of this strategic exclusion as connected to this post-lawmaking phase. And I know that's the main point of your paper. And I thought that was really an excellent point because we have so much work that focuses on this post-lawmaking phase of closing civil society space. And then the next thing that I thought was great is, this literature that you covered, it covered both developed democracies and their interactions with CSOs, and then all the gamut of I think, possible different ways that we arrange CSOs, and then looked at developing aid recipient states as well, and discussed their interactions. So I really loved the really wide-ranging literature review. So I have three main suggestions that I think will help the paper land quickly. The first is really highlighting the value added of the CE or the SECC, strategic exclusion and co-optation and containment theory. So what do I mean by highlighting the value added? So really, I'm interested in whether the framework is just to help us understand the rise of the phenomenon, the consequences, or describing the phenomenon. I was a little bit unclear as to where the theory would offer the best predictions. My second comment here is there something that's unique about strategic exclusion and co-optation, yes, that we don't get just by joining the SE component and the CC component from Howell and Lind. So the question here is there a value here that's more than just the sum of the two parts? If this is a strategic focus or a strategic theory, the focus is almost completely on the state and not on what the CSO is doing prior, during, and after the regulations. And so I would like more about the interaction between the state and society, especially since this is framed as a strategic theory. And then the second kind of big point under this category of the value added of the framework is there something different here from the phrase that I hear more frequently in this area, which is closing civil society space. And so I know this is framed as consistent with counterterrorism policy and the security environment, but in the closing civil society space literature, we have some other explanations for why we see this growing phenomenon. And Dupree, Ron, and Prakash talk about this as something that's happening in aid recipient countries in times of political uncertainty. There's a real recent piece in ISQ by Glacius, Schock, and DeLange, where they say that this is a learning process. So states are learning from other states, and they're learning, they actually say, by example, not by threats. So they would go against this idea of a security kind of backlash. And then there's a real recent piece in BJPS that talks about, it's by Bach, Mitchell, and Schmidt, and it says that this is a human rights dynamic. So countries that have signed human rights treaties, but still have human rights violations are where we'll see these regulations. So my question is kind of, how does this framework relate to those? My second big point has to do with the discussion of the CSOs and differences between them. So the early focus of the paper, I thought, was on service provision NGOs, and then it later turned to advocacy. And I think maybe some really key definitions here might help, because the question I had is, why would we expect a service NGO that's maybe non-political or non-political-ish? Why would they ever want to be included in counterterrorism legislation, or why would they expect to be included in counterterrorism legislation? So by what authority are they saying they should be included? And were they ever included in the first place? So if this is a service NGO, even before this growing phenomenon, would they have been included in kind of the legislative process? Second, related to this idea of the discussion of CSOs and the differences, there's a time where you talk about bad versus good NGOs. And my question here is this an information environment where we ever really know whether an NGO is truly bad or truly good? And if so, how? And if we do know that, is that information going into the state's decision to enact these legislative tools? And then my third big comment or thing to think about are the case information. So I was not sure why the focus was on the 19 countries that you focused on. And then within those 19 countries, why was then the focus on these three countries that you discuss a lot more? And so I think more justification as to those countries and what they represent and how they were selected, I think would be really, really helpful for me as the reader. For the 19 countries that you look at, I would actually recommend looking at the variety of democracies CSO repression variable and see how that variable is showing that these countries are behaving when it comes to CSO repression. And if that variable does not show the same kind of unique trajectory that your approach is, I think that would actually give you value added for your approach. Related to the case information, I wasn't sure of the time period. And also, I wasn't sure about the stickiness of these laws. So do countries that move in enacting these new legislative tools, do they then move in the opposite direction? And I think that would be really important to show, because it looks like this is just kind of a one-way street, right? You enact these SECC legislation and then things just stay. And I would really be interested in whether that's the case in all of these cases. For the three cases that you covered in more detail, there's no CSO names that are ever provided. And so I think maybe a focus more on the organizations themselves would actually be really important here, and talk again to that strategic dynamic. And then finally, on the case information, what about pre-existing differences in state and society? Russia was very bad for NGOs and CSOs prior to this securitization. Australia is still better than some. And I think the relative position and the pre-existing differences might help explain the importance of the securitization in leading to these changes. So I really hope these comments are helpful in some way, and I think this paper will land at a really great journal soon. So thanks for letting me read it.
Thank you very much for the comments. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Murdie. I appreciate that. We will just turn it straight over to Professor Sidel, if that's all right. And then Emeka, after, I'll give you a chance to respond.
Thank you, Alicia. And Emeka and everyone, great to see you. Thank you very much for including me. Let me start off, frankly, by saying, Emeka, that you have already had by far the best comments you're going to get from the commentators on today's paper. My comments will be both of less quality and less well organized than Professor Murdie's comments. So I want to warn you of that in advance so that you are not overly disappointed, but you will be disappointed in the quality and the organization of my comments. I come out of law. I don't do theory. So you have to take my comments in the sense as someone who's sort of coming at this from a slightly different direction. I thought the paper was really interesting, both in terms of the theoretical aspects and then tying that back to several case country examples, the 3 country examples you give. Based on where I'm coming from, and I don't know if everyone would react the same way, I thought that until you got to the case country examples, the paper was largely, and that this is probably how you intended it, because you intend it to be a theory paper, but it really was sort of an argument among theories, or an argument as to why pre-existing theories in a theoretical sense are inadequate. The co-optation, et cetera, I mean, Jude and others. And this may just reflect where I'm coming from. I sort of, until I got to the case studies, kept wishing for, hungering for something that would undergird or serve as a basis in reality for the theoretical arguments that you're making. Now, that may not be the point of the paper. You may have done all the work on reality in Nigeria and other countries that you care to do, and the point of this paper was to move to the theoretical debate. But I still, as I read it, I still hoped for 2 levels at the same time, not just the theoretical reasons why previous theories were inadequate, and so there was a need for something new and something more integrative, but also something that was more based in actual practice. This links to a point that Professor Murdie was making, and making far better than I can make it, which is that we have theoretical perspectives in the scholarly community, in the advocacy community, like the ICNL group, International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, that I work with, that you know very well, and that others may know. This is really expressed, as Professor Murdie was saying, in the closing civil space literature, the closing civil space agenda. And for most of the people who work in the advocacy community, whether it's around ICNL or the democracy groups in Scandinavia or lots of other groups or some of the funders who are working on this, a number of them, with apologies to Jude Howell and lots of other people, would not recognize most of the theories. What they recognize is the overarching umbrella, and Professor Murdie was saying this much better than I can, the overarching umbrella of closing civil space. So as I read the paper, I sort of wondered idly whether the debate was among the scholarly theories or whether you were also saying something to the closing civil space people, the closing civic space groups. You're certainly doing the first. I sort of wondered whether implicitly you were doing the second at the same time, but I wasn't sure. Couple of other comments. And you can already tell, Emeka, that I was right when I said that Professor Murdie's comments would both be better and better organized, but there you go. We are now 20 years past September 11th, almost. In fact, I think there is room for a really good special issue of a journal, or maybe even an edited volume on theoretical aspects of this 20 years after September 11th, and that your paper could fit into a theoretical special issue of a journal in one field or another, or a volume that talks about the theoretical side of this. But the other point I was going to make is that most of the literature, I think, sort of takes us through 2012, 2013, 2014, and then some people moved on to other things. But that leaves an opening for you, I think. And I don't know if it fits in this paper or not, which is perhaps in some ways to say, look, the literature takes us through, call it 2013, whatever it is, roughly 2014. How do developments since 2012, 2013, 2014 sort of fit into our understanding of what Howell and lots of other people were formulating in the sort of first decade to decade and 2 years after September 11th. And then if you want, although I think it's probably too much for this paper, we now face the question as to what degree the COVID situation changes the relationship between the states and nonprofits after 20 years of whether it's your framework or other people's framework. We're now in a new stage, and I don't know if you need to raise that. That may be a completely different body of work. When I got to the end of the paper, and I'm going to stop in a couple minutes. When I got to the end of the paper, I sort of wished, but this reflects sort of my, you know, sort of my interests. I sort of wished you'd started with what you're probably sick of starting with, which is the case studies. You've done a lot of writing about Nigeria and other countries. I know this is a theory paper, but I sort of wished you had done more on the reality on the ground, using the reality on the ground, Nigeria or other countries, to say what might be missing in current theories, and then to lead toward your reformulation of the theoretical side. Instead, what you do is begin with the theory arguments, which are very well developed, but not necessarily grounded in the reality of what's happening in your 3 case studies immediately, and then turn to your case studies as a way of supporting or bolstering the theory, the SECC theory that you're setting up. And at the end, I wondered whether it might come out more strongly if you started with the reality, explained how that reality was explained in current theories, and then in effect asked the question, are we missing something in the reality and the current theories, and here's something that might explain the reality better. That's a sort of reverse approach from the approach you took. I'm not sure that fits in with the way of doing theory in your field, which is different from my field. But I don't do theory anyway, so I really wouldn't know. But I did want to mention that because I did wonder about that as I was reading this. I also wondered whether, given the approach you took, you may be trying to explain a little too much through your reformulation of theory. The paper winds up sounding a bit like, here's the reformulation of theory, and it can explain very different cases because I'm mobilizing evidence from multiple cases. And issues there with the theory then being used to explain too much, and of course comparability among the cases. As Professor Murdie pointed out, again, far better than I can, Australia is different from Russia, is different from Nigeria, et cetera, and that may cause some issues. But I'm also aware that people's writing proceeds in different ways, and you may be ready to do the theory when people like me are then, and you may view it this way, although you probably never say it, always trying to sort of drag you back to what you were doing before, which is explaining really well, which you have done, how this has played out in Nigeria and other countries. But I think how it's played out in Nigeria and other countries, and then sort of thinking about how other people have explained that and what some of the gaps might be, and then having that sort of rise to your theory, I wondered whether that might also be an option to think about. Since this is a theory paper and since we're coming up on 20 years, I did wonder as I read the paper, and I mean, you or others could be in touch with journals about this, whether this might fit into something that marked the 20th anniversary of September 11th from the theoretical perspective. In which you would join with other theoretical papers that are grounded in particular countries or particular regions or particular comparisons. And that it might fit more happily within that kind of a collection, whether that's a journal or a book, than an individual submission to an individual journal. I don't know if anyone's planning that. CSO's in government 20 years after September 11th. And in fact, I hadn't thought of it before reading your paper, but I think it'd be a good thing for someone to do. And I think a paper like yours would be a terrific participation in that kind of thing if someone were putting it together. All right, I have talked long enough. I'm going to stop there. And thank you, Alicia, and everybody else, George, and everyone for giving me the opportunity to comment. Terrific paper, Emeka, and good luck with it.
Thank you so much, Professor Sidel. Appreciate those comments. Emeka, if you want, you don't have to take this up. You could say, I just want to open it up to questions. But, I did want to give you the chance to, if you have any kind of burning questions or anything you want to directly respond to, please feel free to do that now. Otherwise, we can open it up to everyone else's questions.
Okay, yeah, I thank Professor Mark and Professor Murdie for their comments. Like, they are really very helpful. I'm going to reflect on that. I mean, I don't have an answer yet. I'm going to watch the video, reflect over the questions that I raised are very, very important, and I'm going to, consider that in reworking some aspects of the paper. So I really appreciate the comments. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, sounds great. So I would love to just open it up. We're a pretty small group, so I think we can take questions maybe one at a time. So if anyone has a question.
I have a question.
Please feel free. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question/comment. So I was wondering about what the incentives of the state. So I'm not I don't really study NGOs or civil society. It's actually a very interesting paper to me. But I was kind of wondering what the state's incentives are to begin with in excluding these types of organizations. Because if you think about service NGOs and advocacy NGOs, there's an incentive for the state to free ride on the services that they're giving, which is why the state is more open, and especially in places where state service provision is weak, right? So there's an incentive to free ride on the ability of the NGOs to kind of act as a state substitute without alienating the state from the society. But I was having a hard time kind of thinking about what the incentives are for the state to actually allow NGOs to be included in counterterrorism laws. That for me was a very what was difficult to kind of understand, because in the way that I'm thinking about it, if the state has nothing to gain from it, then regardless of whether there's a fear that these NGOs would create anger about the state or whatever, there's no incentive for them to be included to begin with, right? So I just want to ask whether there is an incentive for the state to begin with, and what are the costs if they include these NGOs in counterterrorism laws, and what would be the outcome should they be included?
Okay. Should I answer that?
Yes, please go ahead. Thanks, Emeka. And
Okay.
thanks for that question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a very important question. Like civil societies play an important role in terms of the drafting, formulating of legislative drafts or for the states, I don't know for other countries, but for Nigeria, in drafting and making laws, it passed through various stages. One of the first stages in drafting laws is that various stakeholders are invited and they make their own contributions on that particular law. And civil societies are always invited in Nigeria. They're always invited to contribute, to examine, to do their own research to know what are the challenges that the law might pose if it's passed. And so, yes, and that's why civil societies are usually employed. But for in the context of counterterrorism, the state did not really engage civil societies, or civil societies went, because the state, they know that the nature of the law is that it glosses over the issues of human rights in particular. The nature of counterterrorism laws is repressive. And so they believe that bringing in civil societies, they would quickly identify those areas of the laws that are repressive and would want the state to amend these parts of the law before they are before they become the bill, before they become law. So it doesn't pose any challenge or so. And that's, but in the context of counterterrorism, civil societies were in some way were excluded by the state because the state didn't want them to challenge the law, because they believe that challenging the law would be counterproductive in terms of enforcing counterterrorism laws. And so that's why the state excluded them. And that's the challenge, because these laws were hastily passed without considering human rights components that are important in enforcing. And people have said, if you want to enforce counterterrorism laws, it has to be done responsibly, so it doesn't create platforms that would then lead to more rise of terrorism. Because if rights are violated, it leads to grievances that are often exploited by terrorist group, to recruit followers. And I mean, in countries, in Nigeria and in countries like Kenya and so, where rights are violated in process of counterterrorism, it creates grievances that terrorist groups do exploit. And they use that to recruit followers, project the narrative that their government don't care about them. And if they come to them, so yeah, that's the danger in excluding civil society organizations in the enforcement of, or in the formulation of these security laws.
Sorry, but if that's the case, then shouldn't it be an incentive for the state to find CSOs that they can co-opt, such that repressive laws can be made legitimate in the eyes of the public, right? So shouldn't they have an incentive to find a CSO that could potentially gloss over the human rights violation and then make that counterterrorism law a little bit more legitimate and kind of like lower the grievances from the law?
Yeah, that could be a reason. But from my engagement with the literature, is that it seems like most civil societies are critical. You can't engage some civil societies and leave some others, because there will be an outcry. Like usually in Nigeria, they call for, an open forum where they invite all civil societies to come in. So if you do that, all civil societies would come, both those advocacy organizations and all kinds of organizations will be there. And so, yes, they are going to identify those issues. They're not going to just play with the states and allow those issues that violate human rights laws to. For instance, in Nigeria, we have a social media bill that has currently attracted a lot of arguments from various quarters. Yes, there have been states or the civil society organizations that in some way try to provide explanation for social media bill. For the social media bill regulates the use of social media in Nigeria. I mean, it restricts the use of social media applications in Nigeria. And so that has been a contestation between the state and civil society organizations. The bill is still in the National Assembly because civil societies are not, they refuse to accept any law that impinges on the rights of people. And so, yeah, the state would have, it would be difficult for the state to really co-opt civil society to accepting laws that violate the rights of individuals or so. So yeah, that's my take on that. So yes, but I could also, I mean, look at what you are saying in terms of if the state would look for those organizations that would, help them to provide a form of legitimation for their law. Yeah, but in terms with my engagement with the literature, it tended towards excluding most civil society are excluded, or even when they are engaged, they are not given time to reflect more on the bills before they are passed into law. So they are hastily, passed into law and enforced. So yes, that's my take on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I see Molly's hand, and if I'm missing anyone, please feel free to send me a note in chat, and I can call on you in order. So I will turn to Molly.
Sure. Hopefully you can't all hear the construction in the background. They decide to drill in my apartment building every time I have a bunch of calls. But I thought this was really interesting, but I will preface Mika by telling you that we are so far outside of the lane of things that I do. I'm going to come at it from a very comparative, I think, perspective. So feel free to disregard some of these things that I'm about to say, depending on kind of where you plan to send this and who your audience is. But I'm going to echo Mark's comment about maybe starting with an illustrative example. Because one of the things that I found really hard reading this paper was, and I know you're theory building, right? So you're trying to keep it generalizable, but it felt very vague, right? So when you talk about the types of organizations that would be involved, even in the US context, I don't know who that is, right? Like I can't think in my head of an example of like what's a CSO that would be involved in CT legislation in the United States. Like I still don't know the answer to that. So I think if you started with an illustrative example from any of the countries you're interested in talking about, that would kind of address my problem, right? I would be able to kind of be like, oh, okay, like here's this example he laid out to start. I have a better sense of what exactly it is that we're talking about. The other thing that I was thinking about kind of builds on one of Amanda's comments, which is, as a comparativist who studies governance, right, and kind of different types of intersecting governance, it felt to me like you really stripped the CSOs of agency. And so, I would be thinking about this from the perspective of CSOs are also rational actors with their own goals and incentives, and kind of they're trying to operate for different audiences potentially than the government is. And you kind of get at this, I think, at one point on page 8, going by the Microsoft Word pages. I noticed you talked about the government's relationship with CSOs being conditioned in some, to a great extent, I think, really by their external audiences. So you talked about donor darlings and donor orphans. And so it seems like, one of the questions I had was, is the government behaving in this way with regards to CSOs because they're donors or because international actors who matter to them want them to? Would they do this even if they weren't equally kind of subject to those pressures? Or is it just because there are these external actors and they're trying to put on a show? Or is it both, right? Or maybe that level, what I suspect is true, is that level varies, right? Depending on a variety of different features that are kind of specific to each country. And so I would have pushed you to maybe engage with that or kind of discuss that a little bit more. And then the other thing that I was wondering, so a lot of my work focuses on the Sahel in particular. So I know this paper is very much focused on kind of 9/11 and the effect that that had on global CT strategies and environment. But, I think a lot about how countries with their own kind of different extensive histories of engaging with, different types of CT activities are affected by that, right? So the way that Burkina or Mali are approaching this legislation and addressing CSOs when they've got the French and Barkhane and all of these other kinds of things going on, it's not clear to me that 9/11 is the most relevant kind of frame in a place like that that's got a lot of its own kind of stuff going on. But you study Nigeria, so I'm sure you've thought about this, and maybe it just doesn't come through as much in this as it could, or you could maybe leave an opening for discussing other kind of momentous events in CT kind of development and evolution. So anyway, I'll stop there. It was really interesting to read your paper, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like the points you raised are very, very important. It starts on starting with an empirical, practical events that have happened, or so identifying certain civil society organizations. I'm going to structure. I mean, that is consistent. So I'm going to restructure it in that way. Yeah. And yeah, the points you made are really very good, and I'm going to reflect over them in the course of, afterwards, after this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else with question, comment?
Do we know whether anyone's, sorry, do we know whether anyone's thinking about a 20th anniversary journal issue or volume on these issues to which Emeka's paper, but then the work of others could fit into? I haven't heard of anything, but I'm more likely to hear about the law side of this, certainly, than the political science or international relations or sociology or other sides of it. But I'd be interested to hear if anyone's thinking or planning that, because 20 years is a reasonable marker to ask a range of people, including Emeka, to reflect on this, perhaps from a country or regional perspective, and whether the theories are adequate, inadequate, things like that. So I figured I'd ask whether anyone's heard of anything like that.
I have not.
Yeah, well, and I might ask, I mean, I think going off of this, what your ideas were, Emeka, for where this might go, and relatedly, if anyone in the audience might have some suggestions for where Emeka might send this as a journal. You might have an idea already, Emeka, so I'll turn it over to you to suggest, but I always find this helpful to kind of hear where other people think it might go, so.
Okay, yeah, well, any of the civil society journal would be good, but I also think, I don't know, maybe Professor Amanda Murdie would tell me more about if it would fit with international relations journal or so, or international security journal. But naturally, one would expect it to be submitted in NGO related, like Voluntas or non-profit and voluntary sector quarterly, you know, most of the NGO literature. But I was hoping if it could fall within the international relations, international security. I know, of course, it borders on issues that concern international security or strategic studies. So yeah, I've not decided. I don't know yet which particular journal would be suitable. Yeah.
So I was going to suggest sending it to a security journal. So there's a lot of stuff, as you know, in Voluntas and all the other civil society journals on this exact topic. And so I think maybe sending it to a security journal, and even just specifically a terrorism journal, would add a lot to the way that scholars in that area were thinking about the effects of counterterrorism legislation.
Sorry, can you come again? I didn't get that. This network kind of was a little bit.
Yeah, so sorry. So I think you should actually send it to a terrorism type journal or a security type journal. So there's a lot of writing, as you know, in this area in the civil society journals. And I think the value added might be like taking these arguments and presenting them to the terrorism community and the counterterrorism community that might not be as aware of the effects that their legislation has had. So I think that might be a really fruitful avenue for where to send this.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
That's a great suggestion. Does anyone else have any suggestions of where it might go?
I agree with Professor Murdie that the civil society nonprofit journals have seen a lot on this. That's NVSQ, Voluntas, and the others. We're just mentioning those two, but there's 5 or 6 of them. It doesn't mean it wouldn't fit in there, but I think then you need to make a strategic decision about what kind of article it is if you want to send to one of the civil society journals. They've seen a lot of grounded pieces. Civil society and the state in the United States after 9/11, civil society and the state in Nigeria, including your work after 9/11, et cetera. So that's the sort of grounded approach. But increasingly, I'm not personally certain it's the best trend myself. Increasingly, I think the civil society journals are interested in theory building, and so they might be interested in something that tries to build on previous theory, especially within this civil society realm. But I think that brings up questions about whether to start from the grounding and then get to theory, or whether to try to do a theoretical piece. Either one is complicated within the range of roughly 8,000 words that they'll take. And fundamentally, I agree with Professor Murdie that the civil society range of journals has seen a lot on this. So in effect, the argument you'd be making is that you're saying something new, either about the situation on the ground or about theoretical implications, some years after most of the articles appeared initially, in the initial stage on this, which, as I said, I take roughly through 2012 to 2014. And that might be a good argument too, whether you start from the grounding and proceed to theory, or whether you really sort of critique the theory from the start, and then use the cases to bolster your theory, which is the approach you're taking now. But without knowing the strategy journals, the terrorism journals, or unfortunately, most of the rest of the top of the areas that were mentioned, I'm tempted to think that you might want to go in the direction that Professor Murdie mentioned, just because there may be less that has appeared in those journals. And anyway, for what it's worth.
Thank you. So does anyone else have any questions before we? So I do, actually, I don't want to take up. So, and I was just, this has kind of been mentioned. I think everyone's kind of alluded to this, but I really was wondering about this choice of case studies. Megan, just wondering, you know, if you could tell us a little bit more about how you made those choices of both the 19, you know, the 19 countries that were included, but then also the 3 case studies. And I was just wondering if you could tell us your thought process, you know, into this paper.
Yeah, you know, what I did was to map 19 countries where I, you know, after reading the literature, I identify what scholars have written on the various ways the state has engaged civil society in these countries. So yeah, reading the literature, I saw in different case studies, because most scholarship on these issues, they looked at it in various case studies on how the state civil society relation, the context of counterterrorism. And so that informed my, you know, identifying these with these countries, and also stating how the theory, the elements of the theory fits with the these various contexts, like the isolation of civil society organizations and enforcing, in formulating laws and you know, stripping them of agency in their exclusion, and then, you know, weaponizing the laws to repress them, or establishing a vague laws that makes it difficult for civil society organizations to operate. And so, yeah, I identified these in various political contexts, in various research that have been done, and I brought them together. And then I used the case of Australia. Like I wrote in the paper, Australia represents a state where you'd have a good, civil society that has a good relation with the state, or well-established civil society organizations, and civil society organizations that, you know, project try to project democratic principles or so in developing countries. And then I am stating that even with these futures of civil societies of Australia, you could still identify, you know, the elements of the how the states have excluded some civil societies in Australia, like human rights organizations, in terms of hastily formulating these laws and enforcing them. The nature of these laws, even in these advanced countries, you would see how terrorism is defined broadly, and how the whole issue of material support is still vague, and it's still a matter of legal contestation in these states. Even in advanced democracies, you still see elements of these, you know, contestations between the state and civil society in terms of the laws that have been established, in terms of the clauses that are in the laws, and in terms of how the laws have been enforced, and how certain categories of civil society have been targeted by states. The case of Uganda, represents a state you would describe, or some would describe as hybrid regime that has elements of democracy and authoritarianism. And of course, you see how the laws, counterterrorism laws are, of course, civil societies were not, you know, involved in making these laws, and how the definition of terrorism in these laws, you know, makes it difficult for civil societies, organizations to even protest or advocate. Doing so will be termed as terrorists, or be an act of terrorism. For instance, in Nigeria recently, I don't know if you have heard of the NSAS protest that was, recently those who were organized the NSAS protest have been restricted from accessing their accounts by the CBN, and they have been termed as terrorists. So that is what most of these authoritarian states, they do in terms of they use the language of terrorism, because it gives them, it's an exceptional law. It gives them the right to, do whatever they like. And it's vague. It's not clearly defined. So it empowers the state. They weaponize the law to repress credible oppositions or those that. So you would see that in Nigeria, you see that in Uganda, you see that in Kenya. And I chose Russia because Russia represents a case study whereby beyond terrorism or counterterrorism, where the state perceives civil societies as threats. For instance, in Russia, the civil societies are seen as threats because of Western influence. They believe that the Western countries are trying to use civil society organizations to influence, and it threatens their grip on power. And so the Orange Revolution comes to mind. And so the states responded by establishing laws. The NGO law of 2006, the Foreign Agents Law of 2012 was established by the Russian government and the Russian government, they have a process of democratic participation or involving civil societies through their public chamber group that comprises of civil society. But in this case, in the case of established NGO laws and the foreign agent laws, they were not invited, they were excluded. And so the state then, it created all kinds of confusion, even as I identified in the paper. So now choosing Russia I tried to explain that beyond terrorism and counterterrorism, in a situation where the state believed that civil societies pose threats to its sovereignty or to its national cultural heritage or security objectives, they are more likely to isolate them, establish vague laws, and weaponize the law to delegitimize and criminalize these organizations.
It's 4 o'clock.
So yes, that's the reason why I identified these countries and bring them together to explain, to say that the laws, the SEC could help us understand beyond counterterrorism. It could help us understand the nature of state-civil society relation in the context of conflict, violence, and security more broadly. So yes, that's a bit ambitious, but I am. I'll try to make that argument. So yes.
Thank you. So I see Mark has a hand up. Mark, so I'll let you ask our final question of the colloquium.
A very quick one. Okay, so I did not introduce myself. My name is Mark Kwacha. I'm a student of Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, a PhD candidate. So listening to you and then reading the paper, the question that I had is what a lot of people have already asked, but I would want to say, for the sake of emphasis, you want to pay some attention to this. It's still about the case selection.
Yeah.
You might run the risk of selection bias.
Okay.
If I may put it this way. So I was just asking how representative is, for instance, Australia of developed democracies?
Okay.
Is that the point that you are trying to carry? Is that the message, that Australia is representative of developed democracies, that Uganda is representative or generalizable of hybrid regimes and how they pursue counterterrorism policies? Is that a message that you are trying to send across? If that is the case, then you want to highlight it in the paper and show why they are representative of those countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be anchoring on these arguments that have been made in terms of how various countries have been classified as advanced democracies, emerging democracies, or hybrid regimes or so. Now, I'm not going to delve so much into that argument. I'm going to, anchor on what has been, how these states have over the years been projected in terms of the levels of democracy in that. So it's not more like, well, I don't know, you could say it's a selection bias, but I felt it's more like, using these descriptions having theorized over the years. I mean, in terms of describing many of these countries, the nature of their political regime also, to, to be able to make the arguments that I'm making here. So yeah, I would expand more on that. I would try to provide better explanation of the reason for describing these political regimes as advanced and hybrid or authoritarian governments. So.
Okay, thank you all so much. I am conscious of people's time, so and I'm so grateful for everyone being here. Emeka, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It was really fantastic. Yeah, Esmeli, very good. We really enjoyed it, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amanda, thank you for your comments. Mark as well. I know he had to leave, but really appreciate you taking the time, to provide comments. And thank you to all the audience members for being here. Really appreciate your contributions to the discussion. If you do have comments, if you've written comments, please feel free to send them to Emeka. That's always helpful. And I do, just before we end, want to highlight upcoming events. So George, you're running the next one, correct?
Yes, so we have the next one, December 3rd. That will be Michael Echampon, who will be presenting some work on members of parliament in Ghana and their constituency level relationship. I think it's about selection. So, just as you have been present, I would really appreciate it if you all join the meeting and share your thoughts as well. We'll be circulating as usual, the papers, the paper and the time and the link to the list. So I look forward to seeing all of you.
Thanks, George. And because we will be preparing for our spring colloquiums, we will also shortly be sending out a call for papers. So I do, please share with your colleagues, your students. It's a really great opportunity, and so look out for that. And thank you all for being here today. And again, Emeka, thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you very much for the discussants for reviewing the paper, and everybody that attended. Thank you all very much for everything. I mean, I'm happy, I'm excited. I'm going back to the drawing board to look at the work and, highlight most of the things that have been said today. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.